BookTube, you might not know this, but I have a few different book clubs running every month over on the Fable app. And today we're going to talk about the Fantasy Sickos Book Club and some of the books that we have read and discussed this year. So as we work through this and you think that this might be your jam and you want to join over 6,000 Fantasy Sickos, I'll provide a link in the description that'll take you right to it. Also, there's a link tree in my bio that's got all of the book clubs that I've got going along with my other efforts like Patreon, TikTok, IG, etc., etc. Now, every month I provide 4 options to the group, and sometimes it's book 1 of a series, sometimes they're all standalone, sometimes there's a mix, and whichever one gets the most votes is our read for the next month. And the reason that I chose the Fable app for this exercise is because you get their spoiler-free chapter discussions, which are really cool. So yes, you've got the regular book club lobby, but each book, the chapters are broken down. So you get to read a chapter 1, and then you can go into that chat room and discuss solely things that happen in chapter 1 and your thoughts on them, which is fantastic because you can share your positives, your negatives, your theories, your evolving feelings about the books, jokes in real time as you work through the book. Now, today we're going to cover the first quarter of the year in this one with the Fantasy Sickos. We've got 3 books to cover from January to March of 2024. So let's not stand on ceremony. Let's start the show. Our first book as a group is one that I've mentioned in my last video, which is entitled, If You Like This Fantasy Book, Read This History Book. The history book was Iris Chang's book on the Nanking Massacre. And one of the books that took pieces from real events from the Second Sino-Japanese War was the Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This is about a traditional family living in a remote patriarchal village that provides defense to the empire with swordsmen, and they possess magical abilities, not unlike you've seen in like The Last Airbender. You've got a son who is training to be a warrior, a mother who has a secret past. Those are your 2 main POVs, and I really don't want to go much further into the plot there and spoil anything. I personally love the mother, Misaki. I need my characters to sing, and I can forgive a lot if I can fully invest into the characters. And Misaki in this one is brilliant. She is a mother that isn't totally defined or confined by her motherhood in the story. She's strong. She's complicated. She's very easy to root for. And she's a great example of how to execute a female main character. You feel everything that she feels, and she goes through a lot. So check that box on this one. Now, this is a story about how we process and deal with our emotions. It's about our upbringing, our surroundings, our expectations, our trauma in our formative years that impact and inform us as we grow. That aspect to it is so well done. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned that this felt very 16th century, but as the story progresses, it has a much more modern vibe. Now, there's reasons for this that I won't necessarily get into, but it's a very cool juxtaposition. They also live on a mountain on the tip of a peninsula, which is a very fantasy setting, but the setting, having water and ice so readily available for elemental magic, it just makes sense. Now, while I gave this book 4.5 stars for its compelling plot, strong FMC, excellent battle scenes, and the exploration of its various themes that I've alluded to here, there are some negatives. The first barrier to entry is it has a bit of a slow start. There are flashbacks, there's extra exposition that can feel info dumpy, and the dialogue suffers for that early on. And I think it leans too far into its unique language. I did find myself flipping back to the glossary a lot early, and I was frustrated by some of the choices there, some of the things that I had to look up that were like specific words about measures of time, right? Like, why do we have a special word for a moment later? It just felt like too much. Now, that said, if you stick with it, the pace does eventually pick up. And when it does, it is a wild ride. I mean, you're getting epic battles. They're jet-fueled craziness throughout like a good portion of this book. And also the last few chapters in this, it did feel like it was setting up a series that never came, but I'll just chalk that up to like things happen and it didn't work out the way that she planned it. Now, warts and all, I really still love this book. I think it's a high floor, high ceiling book. If you're on the lower end of it, it's a book that you can still enjoy. On the higher end, it can be emotionally devastating and one that might end up on your Mount Rushmore of fantasy books. For example, here is a review from Grace, one of our fantasy sickos. She says, quote, "The Sword of Kaigen is beautifully devastating. I absolutely loved Wang's character work. She was able to capture raw emotion and conflict deeply. The fight scenes and description of elemental magic had my body tingling as I felt, alongside with her characters, the sense of oneness with water and surrounding life. This was my first 5-star book of the year, and I have a feeling it will be a top book for me, end quote. Now moving on to our February read, which was Malice by John Gwynne. This kicks off the Faithful and the Fallen series, which is a completed series. It has 4 books in total. You start with Malice, then you go to Valor, Ruin, and then Wrath. This is Gwynne's debut book. It was something that he started writing for his family, and they eventually persuaded him to get it published. And that kicked off his career, which is an amazing story, and one that me and Gwynne talked about when I interviewed him recently. So go check that out if you haven't yet, because, I mean, it was a great time. It was an honor to speak with him. Now, full disclosure, I think John is a wonderful human being. I'm a huge fan of his Bloodsworn series, which I'll be finishing this month. I've talked about that before. I'm also friendly with his sons. So yes, there is a personal relationship there. But I never want that to get in the way of being honest in my reviews, because as a book content creator, the number one thing that we have is audience trust. Full stop. If we lose that, we lose everything. I say that not because I didn't like this book, more so because I didn't love it. I gave it 3.5 stars, and my rating scale is a bit generous, but essentially if I complete a book and don't really regret it, right, I'm just kind of like neutral on it, it's probably getting around 3 stars. If it's 4 stars, I think it's really solid. So it lands smack dab in the middle of that. And to date, I haven't felt compelled enough to complete the rest of this series. I think I will one day, but that hasn't happened yet. All that aside, let's talk about the book, the premise, the positives, the negatives, as I saw them when I read this. Now, the plot is straightforward. It's got the chosen one trope. It's set in something called the Banished Lands, where people are still dealing with the consequences of a war that ripped through their land long ago. And there are signs and prophecies that point to a war to end all wars coming on the horizon. Essentially, there are going to be 2 main figures in this inevitable war. You've got the Black Sun and the Bright Star. And as you can guess, if the Black Sun gets control, it's going to be a bad time. Now, the main character that you follow in this is named Corbin, who is a young lad who just wants to be a warrior. Now, I was at the point where I was tiring a bit of this like young adult vibe, even though I wouldn't like categorize this as young adult. I don't think it is. But that colored my experience a bit. I think at the time I called it like ball dropping, pimple popping fantasy, which are words I honestly regret and I feel were a bit too harsh. But I think you get where I'm going with that. Now, for the overall positives, for a debut novel especially, the writing is pretty doggone good. And I think even if it wasn't a debut, it'd still be good. You can see how Gwynne made a career out of this, is what I'm trying to say. The world building and the lore was also very well done and interesting. The creatures were creative, and I'm also a sucker for animal companions, both speaking and non-speaking, and this had that. So it's a personal preference of mine, and this checked that box for me. Now, with any Gwynne book, you at least know he's going to put a lot of thought and research behind the swordplay and the battles. And the writing for those portions really shines through in this. It's a major strength for him. This also sticks the landing at the end. And that strong second half was really important for reasons we'll get into, but it was a satisfying conclusion with some great twists that wrapped up some important storylines while still leaving plenty of meat on the bone for the next set of books. Now, for the cons, I could have used a touch more description on the characters. I could imagine the world, but I never quite got a grasp on the appearances of some major characters. And speaking of the characters, there's a million of them. There's a lot. And the rapid introduction of those POVs had me reeling for, I want to say, like the first 35 chapters. And with the main character, like I mentioned, his storyline with another teenaged NPC, man, it just didn't work for me. And maybe I'm just too old, but I think I was more annoyed with that storyline than anything. what I'm trying to get at here is that if you can survive those first 35 chapters and you're still motivated enough to go on, it does get better, in my opinion. And from what I'm told from others that have worked through this whole series, this is the weakest of the bunch as Gwynne becomes more polished as a writer throughout the series. That wouldn't really surprise me because, again, I love the Bloodsworn saga, so I'll probably give this series another crack in the future. I'll add another review from the Fantasy Sickos here from Terrell's, Terrell? I hope I pronounced that correctly. Sorry, Terrell. His thoughts here. Quote, I thoroughly enjoyed this first installment. I read the Bloodsworn saga first, and this is on par with those in my opinion. My only qualm is this one starts a bit slower, but to be fair, there are quite a few moving parts, so it takes time to build up to the payoff. The characters are likable, it has an intriguing world, and he excels in writing battle scenes. I will read anything he writes. End quote. So a ringing endorsement there from one of our Fantasy Sickos. The third book of the year for the Fantasy Sickos was The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Now, if you've been exposed to any of my previous work, I think you know my feelings on this book and this author. This YouTube channel is in its infancy, and I think I've referenced the First Law World and Joe Abercrombie at least a few times. So if you want more background on this, check out my favorite authors video or my fantasy starter pack video. I do deeper dives on this whole series there. Put simply, this is character-driven. It's a grimdark fantasy series. If you're intrigued by characters that you grow to love disappointing you and characters that you hate surprising you, Abercrombie is one of, if the not best, at getting you inside the characters' heads and letting you live with their thoughts. I mean, he's so good at this that more than a few of the Sickos were getting attached to a relationship between a barbarian and his cooking pot. I really do miss that damn pot. Now, this is gritty as hell, and I think the saying that encapsulates Abercrombie's style the best, and you may have heard me say this before, is that he's a quicker and funnier George R.R. Martin. Now, those aren't my words. That comes from Brandon Sanderson, who is a titan of the genre, and I think he's absolutely spot on with that assessment. Now, I've read this initial trilogy twice. I've read all 10 books in this world. They're all brilliant, but I will note that this is the barrier to entry, this book right here. And that is, the plot is the main issue in this book. It's just not plotting. This is all set up. It's establishing a world and the characters, and that's not to say that nothing happens. There's torture and political intrigue, there's fight scenes, etc., but we really don't get a story that connects it all together until book 2 before they are hanged. It's like Abercrombie said, hey, you need to pass the vibe check first, and then I'll reward you with a plot. This is the only book of his where he does this. I think it was a lesson learned. Same thing for the pacing, same thing for how his female characters vastly improved after this trilogy. And that is a selling point for the author, right? If you even halfway vibe with this book, it only gets better and better and better with each book in so many different aspects. And since I've talked about this so much, I'll kick it to another Fantasy Sicko review. This one is from Maddie, who I know continued on with the series and ended up loving the entire series. She says, quote, everyone who recommended this did a great job of setting expectations. It's super accessible writing, fascinating and unique characters, and a well-built world. This first installment is all set up. We don't know the stakes. We don't have any kind of promise. So there isn't really any real payoff. I like that it isn't trite or straightforward. I love that it's grounded. I really like it all. She continues, it's a solid start. I'm willing to commit to the series. End quote. Spot on. So the next time we do this, we'll be talking about Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson, The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, The Adventures of Amina El-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty, and we're also going to start doing this for the History Sickos Book Club 2024 reads as well. Tune in for that. Smash the like button. Hit the subscribe button for more content like this if you're loving it. I'll see you on the next one. Appreciate y'all.